We're going to move forward here to the ongoing genocide in Palestine and everything surrounding that, including the upcoming trip of Prime Minister Netanyahu to Washington, D.C. next week. We are, as always, very honored to be joined here on the Freedom Side by Layan Fuleihan, who is the Education Director at the People's Forum and an editor at 1804 Books. Pretty good press, if you ask me. Layan, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
Well, great to have you here as always, because it's, hard to sort through some of this news and information. I mean, on the one hand, you have the New York Times and others saying Netanyahu's under fantastic pressure to, make a ceasefire before he comes to speak before Congress. On the same token, he was in Rafah today making this whole big thing about the need for Israel to control the border crossing and more things happening in that regard. So, I guess, in the wake just a few days before Netanyahu travels to Washington, D.C. to speak before Congress. I mean, where do we stand, Layan? Is it possible there could be a ceasefire, or should we believe Netanyahu when he tells us who he says he is?
Well, it's very difficult to make predictions in this kind of scenario. The White House is saying that they're optimistic. They've been saying that they're optimistic for actually, I don't even know how long now, consistently saying that they're optimistic. When Netanyahu is signaling that he's moving actually to draw out the negotiations, he's even making moves that could lead to the end of the negotiations. For example, we had a ceasefire proposal where Hamas showed an immense amount of flexibility, even took away their most bare minimum of asking for a written guarantee of a permanent ceasefire, and said they would be okay with beginning a temporary truce as long as there would be a written guarantee that they would be able to move into the second phase of negotiations without time limits. This is a major sign of flexibility. In response, Netanyahu released 4 demands, which are just completely against any nature of an agreement. I mean, his demands range from not wanting to leave the Philadelphia corridor, so not wanting to remove the Israeli occupation forces from the border with Egypt and Israel, from wanting a guarantee that Israel would be allowed to go back in and militarily resume operations. So basically, he wants a guarantee that the agreement would only be temporary. He wants a guarantee that there would not be the return of any resistance fighters back to the north, and that they would get their hostages. I mean, he's basically asking for a temporary truce to retrieve some of those who are being held as prisoners here in Gaza, and then to be able to return to the massacres that he has been carrying out under his government. So it's really, even his own government is very divided on this. Of course, the more right-wing side of the Israeli government is saying that he should not sign the ceasefire deal, that he should not fold under pressure to reach a ceasefire deal. The opposition is, of course, calling it actually very accurately. They're saying that he is creating obstacles every 10 minutes and that he needs to just get over it and sign it, that he is the main obstacle here. It's clear that Netanyahu and the Israelis have been the main obstacle from the beginning. And this, combined with the fact that the United States has not significantly escalated any pressure on the Israelis to reach an agreement, to me means that it's unlikely, unless Netanyahu changes some of his stance, that there would be a deal anytime soon. But of course, it's hard to predict because a lot of this relies on his statements, his actions. Like you said, he was in Rafah today. He was in Rafah saying that it's critical that the Israeli occupation remains there. So it's really a tense situation that's marked by Israel's intransigence and unwillingness to actually negotiate. And in fact, I'm sure we'll get to this, but throughout the past weeks of negotiation process, not only have they not shown any flexibility, any real flexibility at the negotiating table, but they have increased and intensified their genocidal actions against the Palestinian people. There is no such thing as a safe zone anymore. There is no such thing as any place for Palestinians to shelter. 8 out of 10 UNRWA schools have been bombed in the past 10 days. Eight UNRWA schools have been bombed in the past 10 days, so it's a really very dire situation. The genocide is only continuing.
So, and it is continuing, and it's continuing with horrible, just atrocity after atrocity. I mean, sometimes I'm just completely stunned. I think I've seen the worst, and then something worse happens. That said, Israel does face many challenges. Some of them are a bit more long-term. Israel's running out of tanks. Israel's running out of ammunition. Its soldiers are getting tired. The Israelis are desperate to conquer Gaza. They also want to conquer Lebanon, and they can't do it all at the same time. And yes, they have no red lines from the Americans in many ways, but Israel is not all powerful, right? And one of the challenges is also something that Netanyahu mentioned quite early on, which is protests in Western countries. And so I raise that to ask about the activities that will be ongoing next week. There seem to be many planned activities, protests against Netanyahu's presence, which I have to say, the level of entitlement, it's quite bold. I mean, he's going to come basically demand more support from our elected representatives when a vast majority of Americans support a ceasefire. So, Layan, what can we expect to see in response to Netanyahu's presence in D.C. next week?
Well, we're already seeing quite a bit of outrage because it is extremely bold. It's outrageous that Netanyahu, who is not only a war criminal in every sense of the word, I mean, we're expecting that the ICC is going to release the arrest warrants soon. And even Netanyahu is quite nervous about this. He's lowering the size of the delegation that usually travels with him so that he can take a plane that won't have to make any stops for refueling. There'll be less weight, less people, so that he doesn't have to risk stopping in a country that might be party to the Rome Convention and that would be obligated to arrest him in the case that there would be arrest warrants issued. He's making preparations for this. He's showing up to the United States, which is not part of that does not ratify the convention of the ICC, that does not seem obligated by it at all, and he's going to speak to the Congress, to a united Congress, right before extremely controversial presidential elections. It is absolutely outrageous, and I think what you can see is that the U.S. public, which has gone through a lot over the past 9 months, the political crisis that the White House's inability to respond to the basic demands of the American population around the U.S. Foreign policy regarding Israel and Palestine has created such a high political and intense political crisis, and people are furious. And here would be the executioner, the person who carries out the genocide, using, of course, all of the U.S. resources and support. But this very, vilified persona in Benjamin Netanyahu, hated not only by those who stand with the Palestinian people, which the number of those who stand with the Palestinian people is growing by the hour in the United States public as the genocide continues to unfold in its 9th month, but also hated by people who feel something for the Israeli project. Even Israelis are now rejecting the idea who would come and visit the United States Congress. 500, it came out in the New York Times this morning that 500 Israeli academics, intellectuals wrote letters to Congress asking for the invitation to be revoked. It's really a very controversial visit. He's planning on having a meeting with Biden on Monday, the 22nd, and then he will be speaking in front of Congress on the 24th. We can expect that there will be some rejection of his visit, some visible rejection from some Democratic representatives, of course, but the real rejection is going to come from the American people, from the general public. Many organizations are coming together to organize another national mobilization in Washington, D.C., at the Capitol, to show the mass rejection of Netanyahu's visit, and the mass rejection really at its essence for this blank check that the United States has given to the Israeli genocidal assault on the Palestinian people. Of course, many people will have varying opinions about how that relationship should look like. Many people feel that relationship should not exist, but everyone agrees that Netanyahu himself is completely not welcome, and is certainly not welcome to be speaking to such a high body of the U.S. System. So there's going to be, I think, a massive crowd in Washington, D.C. There's going to be people coming from all over the country. We know people are getting on planes, people are getting on buses. It's going to be historic. We are going to be wearing red, and we are going to say that we are the red line against genocide yet again, and we continue to be the red line, that the White House is not acting in our name. And it's likely to be the largest rejection of any foreign diplomatic visit in U.S. history. It should be very, very historic, and I hope that everybody finds a way to be there.
Yes, well, I think it very well could be. I mean, it's honestly feels surreal that they're even trying to push forward and do this. For those who are looking to find out more information and perhaps educate themselves on some of the things that may or may not be happening, there, Layan, next Wednesday, and how they can, if they so choose, get involved. Where should they go?
Well, they can go to the Shut It Down for Palestine a website. That's Shut It Down for the number palestine.org, or the Answer Coalition website, where you can also see all the bus information, and sign up for a bus, register your transportation there if you want to offer it out to more people. We're all going to help each other get there. It's really important to be there. We need to show Netanyahu actually what it's like to be in one of those massive protests in a Western country that he himself identified many months ago as one of the biggest threats to the success of the Israeli project. We're going to actually show him what it means to be there with a massive protest, rejecting every bit of his agenda.
Well, and let me just ask you this quickly as a follow-up here before we close, which I think is important. And you're speaking to this issue, I think, very well, and you spoke to it throughout. I mean, the role of these protests in disrupting the political scene. I mean, what is the role of these protests that are happening in Western capitals in addressing the issue of the genocide? I mean, we're 9 months in. I think there are many people who may feel, somewhat helpless in some sense because it's so horrifying to watch. So anyway, if you could just speak to that to some degree about this sort of the practical role it really plays for there to be mass protests like this.
Well, it's really a major factor of restraint for how Israel is able to seek out international support for what it is doing right now. The protests across the world, and not just in Western countries, across the world, that have been massive and that have been growing and that have been consistent for now almost a year, which is quite significant, have succeeded in many ways in turning around the Zionist narrative that had until now dominated most corporate and capitalist media. And it is very difficult, as it is clear now, it is very difficult for the United States to give a blank check to the Israelis when the majority of the population is rejecting it. Of course, we know the ruling classes of Western capitalist countries have the means to do whatever they want. And that's why the genocide is continuing right now. And that's why it's the resistance on the ground that is really providing the real confrontation with the actual question of how the genocide will end. But in terms of the ability for countries to continue supporting Israel, and even for Israel to continue getting what it needs to continue carrying out this military operation. We know they're getting tired. We know that they are consistently asking for more and more tools and more weapons and more help because they are not winning. These massive protests make it very difficult for lawmakers and policymakers to continue signing off on the genocide without facing consequences at home. We've created a situation where it is no longer normal to just say you support Israel against the terrorism that surrounds them. It is much more normal now to say you don't support genocide. And it's getting more and more normal to say that you support the Palestinian cause. That is unprecedented, in particular in U.S. public opinion, and is going to have long-lasting impacts on the ability for the United States to continue maintaining a foreign policy agenda, not just in regards to its relationship with Israel, but also the entire region, its relationship with Iran, its relationship with Lebanon. It's going to make it very difficult for U.S. imperialism to continue operating with impunity when the majority of the population is not only awake to what the United States role is, but also is rejecting it. So it's creating a new normal, a new status quo, and we can see the consequences already on the Democratic Party for the fact that they have, under a Democratic administration, they have been unable to respond to the bare minimum demands of the U.S. public on this issue and on many others. So it's going to continue creating this kind of political crisis.
Layan Fuleihan, Education Director of the People's Forum and an editor at 1804 Books. As always, thank you so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.